Welcome back to another episode of My Trauma's Chronic, but I'm iconic. Today we have a very special guest joining us, Michael Eisen, a renowned clinical psychologist with a wealth of knowledge on mindfulness and meditation. In our fast-paced world, it's easy to feel overwhelmed and disconnected from ourselves, but Michael is here to shed light on how mindfulness can be a powerful tool for improving mental health and emotional well-being. Throughout this episode, we'll explore the science behind mindfulness practices, learn how they can be applied in therapeutic settings, and discover practical techniques you can incorporate into your daily routine. Whether you're new to mindfulness or looking to deepen your practice, there's something valuable for everyone. And before we dive in, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe so we can continue to do the work we're doing, making an impact on the world. Grab yourself a cup of tea, get cozy, and let's get started. Can you share a bit about yourself and your journey and what inspired you to become a clinical psychologist?
Sure, yes. I grew up in London, lived here pretty much all my life. Went to university, of course, as well as many people do. And it wasn't originally my plan to be a psychologist. I originally trained in law, but it became clear to me that I wasn't terribly good at it, and also I really didn't like it. So I quit that in my mid-20s. Wasn't really that sure what to do next. I spent a couple of years writing a novel, trying to write a novel, and then that was what led me into psychology, because as part of the research for my novel, I started volunteering in a psychiatric hospital because I wanted to include some stuff about that in this book, which never got finished, and I liked that. And then the financial crisis of, what was it, end of 2008, start of 2009 happened. The day job I was doing to support myself just disappeared. I was doing freelance work, it all disappeared. It was very scary. But then from that came the sudden and kind of obvious realization, hang on a minute, I really like that work I'm doing in the psychiatric hospital. Why am I not pursuing a career in that? So I got online, did some research, found out there was such a thing as a clinical psychologist, and the rest is my personal history.
Wow, that's quite a journey. Do you think you ever go on to finishing the book?
I don't realistically know. As well as not being that good at law, I wasn't that good at writing a novel. Looking back, without being too hard on myself, most people do not have a natural talent for writing novels. I don't think I do. It's also very hard work. It is lonely. I don't think it's very good for one's mental health in general. So, I mean, never say never, but it's not on my current list of things to do.
Um, the one thing that you're really passionate about is like mindfulness and meditation.
Hmm.
How did you first encounter mindfulness and meditation in your practice?
Yeah, well, I encountered it before I was involved in psychology. So in the early 2000s, I was very miserable. I mean, probably depressed. Although, actually, I did go to the doctor. I think they did say yes, depression. So I was depressed, and I was looking for something that would help. And this was one of the things I hit upon. So I did some research, went and did a course in meditation. Didn't really get into it, didn't actually do the practice consistently enough, didn't really keep it up. I suppose I did keep it up. I meditated semi-regularly for years after that. And then I did an 8-week course in mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is one of the major sort of healthcare interventions using mindfulness. Still didn't really get into it. But then a couple of years after that, I was again not feeling great. There'd been a kind of painful and embarrassing romantic misadventure, and I thought, I really need to sort myself out. It's time to meditate. So I started just sitting every day without fail, and after about somewhere between 8 weeks and 10 weeks, it started to do stuff. And I haven't looked back. And by that time, I was training as a clinical psychologist, so it just seemed extremely obvious and natural to take my clinical practice in that direction, which is what I've been doing since.
What role do you think, mental health plays in our everyday lives? Because often people associate it with like a mental breakdown, crisis, and not an everyday life thing.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose that's the two different ways of seeing it. That the idea of mental health may be first became mainstream and current through the idea of mental ill health. It's about, a diagnostic system that says you have this mental health problem, that mental health problem. And that has some utility, that way of thinking. But then the other way of thinking is your mental health is like your physical health. It can be anywhere from really not great to really quite good. And just because it's fine doesn't mean that it couldn't be better, and also doesn't mean that it doesn't need upkeep. In the same way as even if you're quite fit, you could always be fitter, and you won't stay quite fit if you don't exercise. People nowadays also look at mental health in that way, which seems quite sensible. At that point, I think I'd be tempted to ditch the terminology of mental health, this kind of medicalizing of it. And I suppose that's why we find people talking about well-being and wellness and things like that, which are also perfectly good terms to use.
A lot of the time, I feel like a lot of the time when we speak about mindfulness, people think about sitting down quietly for an extended period of time, or just thinking and doing a lot of reflecting. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Mindfulness, comes in many different forms. In your experience, what common misconceptions do people have about mindfulness?
So there's probably a few. I think one thing I should say is that it's kind of the opposite of being lost in thought. So in its core, I probably want to say it's not really about reflection, because that's thinking. It's more about, so possible misconceptions. One would be that it's about thinking, which it isn't really. The other would be that it's about stopping thoughts and having no thoughts, which is possible, but can only be done with extremely large amounts of meditation under intensive conditions. What it's actually about is this third thing that isn't necessarily intuitively something that people know about until it's pointed out, which is that it's possible to have thoughts and be bought into them, fused with them, we say. And it's also possible to have thoughts but not be bought into them and fused with them, and instead to notice them and be aware of them as thoughts. So there's that. There is the idea that you have to meditate. I mean, I'm maybe a bit of a traditionalist in that I think it probably is a very, very, very good idea to meditate if you want to practice mindfulness. It's not that you can't do it without meditation, but it's an awful lot easier if you can manage to meditate consistently. But then again, everyone's different, and I'm sure there are going to be some people who get on great with no meditation, other people for whom it's more important. So I probably shouldn't make any sweeping statement. What other ones are there? There's a kind of, people see it as sort of soft and gooey or something, and that's a shame because it can put people off, and it's not. I mean, it is and it isn't. There are aspects of it that are sort of soft, but there's also there's a side to it that can be all about discipline and rigor. You can be very, 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 very hardcore about meditation if you want to. So if you're into that, you shouldn't feel like this isn't for you. On the other hand, if you're not into that, you also shouldn't feel this isn't for you, because you can emphasize the more relaxed, softer elements to it. So there's a couple there.
Yeah, it's quite varied in the different ways you can go about it. And often, when there's like something new, like such as mindfulness, I wouldn't call it new. I would say it's more like trending, or more, how do I say this? More the limelight now. Like, I can't think of any other words. That will have to do. When did you realise it was not just you that it had an impact on, but the people, like individuals you work with, or the individuals in your life? Can you describe like a moment where you realise the impact mindfulness could potentially have on someone?
Yeah. I suppose it was when it had an impact on me, because I mean, my career with it sort of tracks its fortunes in popular consciousness. When I first was interested in it, it wasn't so big. I mean, it was, it wasn't like completely underground, but it wasn't so big. The point where I really got into it was actually probably peak mindfulness. It's very well known now, but that was where it was really hitting that level. And that's like, sort of early 2010s. That's where you've got Time magazine having a cover of someone meditating. You've got Is it Djokovic at that point, or is that too early for him? You've got like top athletes saying, "Oh yeah, I'm into mindfulness." That headspace is starting to take off at that point. So I was aware of all that, but the crucial thing, and this kind of gets at an important aspect of mindfulness, it's very much about your own experience of it rather than ideas about it or reading about it or hearing about it. So it was when I actually experienced something surprising and awesome from practicing it that I realized, oh my God, there's really something to this. Of course, then you got the danger that you go the other way and you start thinking that your experience is going to be the same as everyone else's experience, and everyone has to practice mindfulness and they've got to do it like I do it, and they're going to have the same experience I have. And there's been a long process of realizing that's not true. But that was the initial point where I thought, yeah, my God, this is great.
Do you think there's a connection between mindfulness and emotional resilience?
Certainly. In my experience, just in my own practice, yes, 100%. That was one of the biggest changes I noticed when I got really into it, was a real change in my emotional life, how I experienced emotions, how I related to emotions. What I experienced is consistent with what a lot of other people report, for sure. I can see it in other people sometimes as well. If you know someone well, like my wife practices mindfulness and I know her very well and I see her every day, and I can see day by day whether she's meditated or not, in the way that I experience her. So yeah, that's a big part. I mean, I can explain how that works if you want, but it might get a bit dry and detailed.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Okay. So this to me is the single biggest thing when it comes to mindfulness for well-being. Obviously, you can use mindfulness for spiritual purposes, and that's great. If you're using it to just feel better, function better, this is the big one for me. It's the way that you relate to emotions. So what I discovered, and now try to often teach to my therapy clients, is that when you're dealing with an emotion, you see it as just this one thing that's quite consuming. It just kind of, the emotion arrives and it just takes over and you feel like this and then it hangs around and it's horrible sometimes. And when you meditate, one of the things you learn to do is deconstruct it. So you discover that an emotion is actually made of a load of thoughts and body sensations. And that body sensation bit people aren't always aware of. And I wasn't very aware of it until I meditated. And this turns out to be gigantically important because you've got this raw feeling in the body, and then you've got this story, this narrative being spun by the mind about the feeling or about the things that are generating the feeling. And what you can learn to do is avoid the extremes of sort of dwelling on it, indulging yourself in it, these sorts of things people say. You can avoid being stewing in your emotion and also avoid suppressing or avoiding your emotion. There is this third option, which is that you can experience the emotion as vividly as is possible in the body, whilst not engaging with the story that plays alongside that feeling. And this turns out to work an awful lot better. It means that the emotions aren't threatening and disturbing in the way that they otherwise would be. You don't need to be trying to avoid them. It tends to mean they don't hang around as long. They kind of move through you a bit quicker and cleaner somehow. And maybe most importantly, you don't need to act them out. You can feel it vividly in your body without that having to actually make you behave in a certain way as a result.
What would you say to someone, or what advice would you give to someone who is skeptical about mindfulness?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Well, I'd say try it. The problem is they'd have to try it in quite a consistent way for a while for it to have a reasonable chance of doing something for them. So that's often not that helpful. If they say I'm skeptical and I say meditate for 40 minutes a day for 8 weeks, they are not going to. I'd probably say fair enough. Even when you get curious enough about it to give it a proper go for it. Until then, I can't prove to you that it's going to do anything particular for you. I don't actually know exactly what it is or isn't going to do for you. And the only way for you to find out will be for you to try it. So I'll say it's worked for me. It's worked for other people. Maybe it'll work for you. So try.
How do you envision the future of mindfulness in therapy and mental health practice?
Mm. Yeah, I mean that's a good question and a difficult one. How do I envision it? I suppose not wildly different from where it is. It is a part of several mainstream therapies and it gets used in that context, but it's not a part of every therapy. And as much as I'm tempted to say it should be, actually, I should probably say no, it doesn't have to be. There are dedicated mindfulness interventions, one of which is in the NICE guidelines, which is the body that tells the NHS what treatments it should use. I suppose it would be nice if that were more widely available, that treatment, than it actually is. That's one answer. Here's another answer. I think that technology is going to be very significant here. So that could be awesome. You know, the use of virtual reality, the use of, they're going to do astonishing things in terms of stimulating the brain with magnetic fields, with sound waves and so on. That, I guess, is going to really change the picture and allow people to, I mean, it might make people like me a bit obsolete because it might well be possible to deliver the same effects as I can teaching meditation by simply putting some sort of device on your head and stimulating your brain in a particular way.
We spoke about mindfulness and we spoke about meditation. Could you elaborate on like the fundamental differences between the two and how each practice serves distinct purposes in therapeutic context?
Yeah, for sure. And that's a really good question because people are often unsure about that when they come to me for therapy. It's often a question I answer. So, mindfulness is a quality of mind or a faculty of mind, you could say. What would be an equivalent? Concentration is something your mind can do. Alertness is something you can have. Well, yeah, you can have mindfulness as well. And meditation is a particular activity which promotes mindfulness and requires mindfulness. So I define mindfulness as being basically the opposite of being lost in thought. And when you meditate, you sort of have to be developing that because when you're meditating, whatever you're trying to do in meditation, the obstacle is that you're going to keep getting distracted by your own thoughts. So you're going to have to keep noticing that you got lost in thought and coming back to your meditation. And you're going to do that again and again and again, and just thousands and thousands and thousands of times. And that is what is going to train your mind to get better at noticing when it's lost in thought and snapping out of it, which is mindfulness. And the more mindfulness you have in meditation, the more you can concentrate on what you're doing in meditation, which opens various meditative doors and can take you to all sorts of places. So the meditation builds the mindfulness, and then the mindfulness allows you to do more and different stuff in meditation.
Like mindfulness is often known in many different in various cultural, spiritual, and maybe even religious practices. In what way do the principles of mindfulness and meditation intersect with various, cultural or spiritual traditions or practices?
Yeah, that is a big and fascinating question. So I have to try not to ramble all over the place. Yeah, it's really, really interesting that you do seem to find versions of mindfulness in all the major religions. I was reading a paper the other day about Christian meditation that actually looks quite like what gets called mindfulness meditation in Buddhism. I was reading about another paper about Islamic mindfulness, how something similar to mindfulness shows up there. And yeah, what are the similarities and the differences? So the ancient Buddhist idea of mindfulness is a bit different than what we tend to traffic in today. It was more about keeping the Buddha's teachings at the forefront of your mind all the time and not forgetting what you're supposed to be doing. Islamic mindfulness, from what I read the other day, is actually kind of similar, at least in that respect, or there's other ones as well. Whereas the secular healthcare version of mindfulness isn't that, it's about a non-judgmental present moment awareness. So it's not trying to keep in mind what you ought to be doing, it's actually just being in the here and now, not really thinking about I should, I shouldn't, etc., etc. However, that version of mindfulness is lifted from later forms of Buddhism that do teach it that way. So within religions, you get different conceptions of mindfulness, you get different purposes for mindfulness. Is it about remembering the teachings? Is it about a present moment non-judgmental awareness that can lead you to some sort of enlightenment experience? In the healthcare setting, the aim is basically well-being, but it does still it travels to well-being along the same paths as it did in at least the Buddhist context. So what they're doing in, say, Zen, which is one of the places the modern secular conception of mindfulness got lifted from, is kind of the same. They're trying to let go of thoughts, let go of thoughts, let go of thoughts, let go of thoughts, on the basis that thoughts are ultimately, in a sense, what creates all forms of suffering. And in an 8-week mindfulness course on the NHS, well, you're doing the same thing. You are stepping out of your thoughts again and again because they cause you to suffer, which is what CBT, the dominant form of therapy probably in the world at this point, that was its insight and its approach. So those mindfulness courses integrate CBT with mindfulness because they're both saying your thoughts get you into a tremendous tangle. So let's not be so taken in by them, convinced by them, and controlled by them.
That was it. The way that you explained it makes it seem so simple. Very good at stuff like that.
Well, I hope so, because it can be a complicated and confusing business.
Yeah, definitely. With that, how I feel like, a lot of the time intersectionality plays a massive part in everything we do. Do the benefits of mindfulness and meditation differ across like various demographics? And if so, how does it do that?
It's a really good question. I don't think I know the answer. I would imagine there are differences, and I've certainly seen when teaching different groups of people, trying to teach them mindfulness, I've certainly seen that what lands in one setting doesn't necessarily land in the other, but I haven't done enough of it to have developed a clear sense of exactly what's going on there and what does and doesn't work with one or another group of people. I'm sure it must be the case. There is research happening. I'm not really familiar with it particularly, and I don't know how much of it there is at this point. So yeah, I'm trying to think what I can usefully say about that. I certainly see differences in just different, just between people. How those then split out across groups is harder for me to say. Yeah, so I'm sorry not to be able to give any like useful detail on that.
It's okay, don't worry. That's absolutely fine. The one question that I always had about mindfulness is what I don't quite understand is how mindfulness and meditation can lead to like neuroplastic changes in the brain, and what implications it might have for mental health treatment. Because it was like when I was doing DBT, when I was going into therapy, it was a very, very heavily discussed topic. So, what is it?
Well, I think I'm actually going to want to say it's probably a topic that gets over-egged a bit in the discussions of mindfulness for the very simple reason that literally everything you do changes your brain. Like every experience you have, as far as we know, is reflecting processes in the brain. So it's continuously changing. Continuously new connections are being formed or broken, and new cells are created, although not at a tremendous rate in adulthood. But that said, I mean, that's maybe not a very helpful answer. What you're doing in meditation and in mindfulness practice off the cushion that you would sit on to meditate, you're basically doing the same thing again and again and again and again. It's insanely repetitive, which can obviously lead to it being boring. So you are training some particular mental skill or some particular sort of experience. And you are in that way, you're kind of grooving something into the mind. So it's analogous to what you do in, say, sports. Two analogies I can use. One is if I keep lifting a weight, I will strengthen the muscles that lift that weight. So it's doing that. It's creating a pathway in the mind that enables the mind to more easily, for example, notice when it's lost in thought. And then the other thing you're doing is a bit like if I'm playing table tennis, which is a sport I truly love. I mean, it's a bad example because people think of table tennis as not a proper sport. So let's use tennis. In order to be able to hit the ball the way they hit the ball, the players have practiced that precise movement, who knows how many times, so that it becomes utterly, utterly, utterly automatic. It's like muscle memory. Again, that's what you're doing in meditation, over and over and over and over and over and over, so that that particular pathway in the brain, however you want to think about that, I guess it's neurons being connected, it becomes, I guess, more and more and more clearly defined and wired in. I don't know whether you get any of these funny effects of bits of the brain actually getting bigger. Again, there's loads of research on this, on the brain and meditation, and they do see differences when they put very serious meditators into an fMRI machine or an EEG. There are differences. But then you've got a problem of causation. Did the meditation make them different, or were they different to start with, which is why they love meditation so much? It's not completely clear.
Yeah. I think there's so much things. I think that's one thing about psychology. There's some things that like, as factual as you can get. And there's
Mm.
something that's completely like theoretical,
Mm.
which makes things really, really difficult to understand. But I guess like other sciences are like that as well.
Mm.
So it's not just completely psychology. You know, like you when somebody for an extended period of time does mindfulness or meditation or a bit of both.
Mm.
How what changes can you see? There must
Mm.
be some small minor changes which leads to major
Mm.
changes as well.
Yeah.
What do those signs look like? Because I know that when I'm in treatment, other people can see the difference, but I can't see
Mm.
the difference.
Mm.
So, what would it look like? Or how can somebody see, like, oh, this mindfulness is actually working for me?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, one way is what you just said, that other people pointed out. It is tremendously encouraging if other people start to say that you seem better. In some ways, it's the acid test. If I say, "Oh yeah, my practice is going amazingly at the moment. I'm really breaking new ground," but my wife isn't noticing that and she's experiencing me as a pain, then what's it worth really? How much change could there possibly be? So that's crucial. The things you'll experience and the things you'll see, they do vary, but you're hopefully going to notice that you are in the present moment more. You're more aware of what's actually happening right now. You are less completely lost in thought. If that goes some distance, you can find that thoughts are actually experienced somewhat differently. That you're much more in the present moment kind of all the time. Thoughts are just less large, substantial and powerful. They become a bit more ephemeral. You might notice just calmness. You just feel calmer. You just feel more relaxed because meditation is by and large a relaxing process. Similarly, you might notice that in someone that they just look a bit more relaxed. They're not moving so fast. They're not so agitated. They're not so wound up. On the thoughts point, you're going to maybe notice that they're not. I think you can hear it when people are caught up in their own thoughts. They're in a stressed, agitated way. They're kind of articulating all this stuff that you can tell is churning around in their mind. And obviously, I'm like that sometimes as well. And that tends to die down. There's a bit less of that. So that's thoughts, feelings to some degree. People often report a sense of being more, people talk about being more open, emotionally open. And I think what we're usually meaning by that is a bit more emotionally sensitive, really, or labile, I think is the some sort of technical term. And it's not necessarily a good thing to be emotionally sensitive and labile. It's not necessarily a virtue to burst into tears very easily, but people do seem to find it positive. Certainly I have in myself to feel more emotionally responsive, more empathic, more easily moved. And what can go with that is, of course, being a bit nicer, because if you feel more empathic, you're less inclined to be obnoxious to people.
I did not expect the obnoxious part. Can you discuss like the importance of self-compassion in mindfulness
Mm,
practices and how it
mm.
impacts emotional resilience in people who are like undergoing therapy, for
Yeah,
example?
yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah, it's tremendously important. Compassion is allied with mindfulness. It has been for a very long time, for a couple of thousand years at least. That the certainly in the Buddhist tradition, it's the idea of compassion has been very, very significant alongside the idea of mindfulness. Very possibly in other religious traditions as well that are making use of meditation and mindfulness. So it's always been there. There's an interesting and slightly sad story to it, how this gets translated into the modern world, and maybe the modern Western world in particular. That in ancient Buddhist meditation, they took self-compassion for granted. So in the traditional meditation on loving kindness or on compassion, first you send it to yourself, then you send it to a friend, then you send it to someone you don't know too well, then you send it to someone who you don't like that much. And we now here, people try this and they find the compassion to self bit the hardest. So hard it can really put them off. It's upsetting, because people try and send themselves compassion and it just makes them think about how much they hate themselves, or something like that. In fact, the ancient form of it, I've heard, they put compassion for the self first because it was the easiest. They took it for granted. Of course, you love yourself, so start there and then send it out. For us, we can't take it for granted. All too often, we like ourselves far less than we like other people, which is really incredibly sad. So there's this huge self-compassion deficit operating seemingly in our modern context, which is incredibly painful for people, and is a part of most kind of mental health problems, if we want to use that language. So anything that can help remedy that is incredibly valuable. And meditation and mindfulness aren't the only way, but they are a way. So you can bring that in very explicitly in meditation. You can meditate on self-compassion. You can make that the focus. I won't say bore you with exactly how you do that, but there's various techniques for doing that. It's also argued that you need it for your meditation. Actually, your meditation will go an awful lot better in other ways if you can manage to be kind to yourself as you do it. And I believe this is true. So the example that smacks me in the face many times, most times I teach someone to meditate, is that the first obstacle they run into is, I can't do it. My mind wanders too much. I can't do it. I'm bad at this. I get frustrated. No, I didn't do the meditation this week because I just got so frustrated. I got upset. And what's happening is that they're running into a failure of self-compassion. The mind wanders and they get cross with themselves. And that gets them nowhere remotely useful. It means that they don't enjoy the practice and maybe they don't do the practice. So right from the start, the first thing that someone needs to learn when they learn to meditate, they need to learn to try and focus on, let's say, the breath. So that's the first thing. The second thing they need to learn is, when you can't do it, notice if your mind starts putting you down or expressing frustration. And in the noticing, you're already starting to let go of that a little bit. So you've taken your first tiny step on the path of self-compassion. Over time, you want to really, really build that up, so that, certainly on some views, your meditation should be at all times suffused by self-compassion welling up from some sort of great lake of it that you've underground lake that you've built.
In your therapy sessions, how do you integrate mindfulness and meditation, and how
Mm.
do you tailor those, practices to meet individual needs? We'll get to this like part of the podcast, but we got people to write in like any sort of
Mm.
like questions they had, and this was
Mm.
one of the common questions. They said they'd be like people,
Yeah,
quite a few people said they've been to multiple therapists, but it's
yeah,
always the same generic stuff.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, so how do I use it? Well, To some extent, I use it in line with a particular kind of therapy called ACT, which stands for Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. And it fits quite well with me because it's a therapy that uses a lot of mindfulness. In that kind of approach, I could frame it very simply. You're using mindfulness to drive positive behavior change. That's the role of mindfulness, to help people do things that are good for them to do, that will help them to enjoy their life more. So it's kind of behavioral orientation. You're not being mindful just for the sake of it. You're not being mindful because it feels nice to be mindful. You're being mindful because that will enable you to do the thing that you haven't been doing because of all your thoughts and your feelings that get in the way. So I use it like that. I go a bit further with it than a lot of people would when they're doing that kind of therapy, because I'm really into meditation. So I also, where people are interested, I will take them a bit deeper into meditation, and teach them how to develop their meditation practice in various ways to enhance their well-being. Maybe I'm not saying very much, so I'm not quite answering the question. So there's mindfulness for behavior change, and then there's developing in meditation, because that in itself can enhance your well-being. I personally at least offer everyone the chance to actually meditate rather than just practicing mindfulness on the go, and that's again a bit different from a lot of ACT therapists. So right from the start, I will say, are you interested in mindfulness? What do you know about it? Would you be open to it? Fine if you're not. If you are, would you like to actually meditate? And if they would like to, I will set them up at the beginning of therapy to meditate and to practice mindfulness, and then see how they go. And some people really take to it. Some people don't really, and we may not get very far with it, and that's fine. If they do take to it, then it can kind of run in the background as therapy progresses. They're doing their practice, they're doing their practice, they're doing their practice every day. And we're checking in about it, and we're introducing different techniques that build on the basic starting point. The starting point is, let's say, focus on your breath. And then, okay, how are you going to handle the thoughts that show up? And then emotions, we're going to look at that technique I talked about earlier, where you learn to feel them in your body. And we're going to look at loving kindness or compassion as part of it, as part of your meditation practice. Those are the main therapeutic aspects, and then there are other ones I'll get into for people who just get into meditation and want to explore it further.
Quite a lot of the time when people go to therapies due to like addressing trauma or something like that, can mindfulness, and if so, if it can, how does it play a role in trauma-informed care, and how can it facilitate that healing experience for people?
Yeah, so this is a really important one, because it can, I think, I'm not sure exactly what the state of the evidence is. I am inclined to think that it can help with trauma, but I can't say exactly how much evidence there is or isn't for that. The way it works when it does that is to some extent similar to any effective treatment for trauma, which is going to involve exposure. The effective way to deal with trauma is at some point to really, really, really vividly engage with whatever memories there might be, and do that until they stop being quite so distressing. Mindfulness offers a way to do this, partly because when you sit and meditate, stuff arises, thoughts come to mind, memories do come to mind. You will have to contend with all your memories. Your worst memories will start to come up at some point. So you're going to have to engage with them. And then what mindfulness adds, or meditation adds, is that technique that I spoke about before that I think is so valuable. Instead of just reliving the memory with an emphasis on the kind of mental aspects of it, mindfulness gives us this option of focusing in on the body sensations. So you can expose yourself very, very vividly to the actual feeling of the memory, the affect, whilst not necessarily getting so caught up in the memories that go with it. And at least, it's a theory that I think might have something to it. That facilitates a certain kind of emotional processing to tune in and actually just feel the memory in the body, as it were, feel the feelings that go with the memory, and also adding in this ingredient of kindness or compassion. So if I can have this horrible memory arise, and I can engage with the raw feeling of it in the body, and I can do this inside a kind of container of self-compassion, compassion for myself, compassion for the me in the memory, compassion for the sensations in the body potentially, which might sound weird, but is something that can be done. If I suffuse the whole thing with compassion, if I know how to do that, does that facilitate some sort of processing that's very helpful, where the memory or the way I experience the memory gets altered in a positive way? So that's how it could help and how it could work. But I also must say that it's a hazard in mindfulness and meditation, that it, precisely in the same ways that it can be helpful, it could be harmful. One of the most common problems in meditation and mindfulness practice is traumatic stuff appearing, perhaps unexpectedly, perhaps overwhelmingly, and people being, I don't know if re-traumatized is quite the right word, I think it probably is. That can happen. So it is good practice for anyone teaching meditation and mindfulness to be very aware of this, to be checking with the people they're teaching mindfulness and meditation to, whether they think that, trauma is relevant to them, and making appropriate adaptations. And there are appropriate adaptations. There are ways to adjust what you're doing so that you don't overwhelm people. There's a book that was written about this by David Treleaven that was pretty good, and I think set out most of the techniques, the adjustments that you'd want to use in that case.
Often, I know as somebody with ADHD, or sometimes you're restless. I know, Matt, all restless, or you're unable to just sit still for a while, or just to implement these, or you don't have the patience, or when the motivation starts lacking, it's very hard to be like, yeah, I'm going to spend at least 5 minutes a day, but you know what, I just can't be bothered.
Yeah.
And that's very common for people who are neurodivergent, or those with
Yeah.
learning styles or cognitive abilities. How can people adapt mindfulness and meditation to ensure it's accessible for those with varying needs?
Yeah. Well, it can certainly be done, and I do this sometimes in my work. It's about integrating it into daily life in ways that are very, very manageable. So, for example, we think of I certainly think of the mobile phone as a significant enemy of mindfulness, right? It is a very, very distracting, agitating thing. It doesn't really put us into a mindful state. But a nice technique that I'm trying to remember exactly whether an old colleague of mine, I think, actually came up with this possibly. No, sorry. Doesn't matter. Basically, it can be your mindfulness practice can be every time you look at your phone, that is your cue to become aware and to have a moment of mindfulness. Of course, you then have to remember to do that, and that is a challenge. So I have to be honest and realistic about the fact that it's not necessarily easy. People do find it hard to remember to practice mindfulness, and then maybe they don't. So it's not like this problem always gets solved and overcome. But that's a way of doing it, to really integrate it into life. I suppose I do always encourage people to see if they can do a bit of meditation each day, because that is what will make it more likely that they remember to be mindful when they look at their phone. But not everyone does that, not everyone wants to do that, and many of those people do very well with just integrating it into life.
What simple mindfulness and meditation practices can individuals easily incorporate into their daily routines, and how can these practices be adapted to fit busy lifestyles? As somebody from London, you probably know, being in London is very fast-paced, it's very on the move all the time. How can we just slow down a little bit?
Yeah. So the things that I usually offer to people first, if I'm teaching them this stuff in therapy, the simplest of the simple practices, feel your feet. And even as I say that, you might find that you naturally start to do it. You're probably feeling the feet. that's it. That's all a person actually needs to do, is to repeatedly throughout the day keep remembering to feel their feet, because every time they do that, they're waking up from distraction and agitation and busyness. They're feeling something in the present moment, which is their feet. They're not lost in thought. So it can be as simple as that, or it can be any body sensation. It could be that you feel your breath every so often. It could be that you feel the clothes against your skin. Sound gets used sometimes. You can listen. I think there are particular advantages to using body sensation, so I start there, but you can use sound. And then you want to peg it to certain activities so that you'll remember. So you need to put in a kind of mental, a kind of calendar reminder that every time I have a cup of tea, that will remind me to be mindful for a few moments at least. So that's one approach, keep coming back to something throughout the day. Another way to do it that some people find very useful is to just be very mindful of whatever you're doing. So I'm drinking water periodically. I can do that with very little awareness of what I'm doing, or I can do it mindfully. I can look and see the cup and notice it. I can feel my hand make contact with it. I can feel the weight through my arm. I can feel the water touch my lips. I can, etc., etc. I can feel myself swallow. So you can try and bring mindfulness to your activities and notice all the various sensory details of them. I think those are the main things that I suggest to people.
How can individuals, identify the right time and environment for practicing mindfulness throughout the day, and what factors contribute to a successful practice?
Yeah. I'd say any time is a good time. You can practice at all times, and you should. One of the main pitfalls for people early on is that they only do it when they think they need it. So they wait until they're stressed and then do some mindfulness. That's not likely to work very well, because it's like waiting until the World Cup final to kick a penalty without having practiced. Think, well, now's the time I'm going to kick it. No, you have to practice it God knows how many times to get it perfect, so that then you can do it under pressure. Mindfulness is the same. You need to practice all the time when you're not stressed, so that you've got it on hand for where you are stressed. The only times when you can't really do it would be if there's some task that is so cognitively demanding that you need to put every ounce of your mental focus on it, then yes, maybe you're not going to be mindful in that moment. And maybe you don't want to be. I mean, even if you're reading a book, you kind of don't want to be mindful. You want to be immersed in the story that turns into thoughts in your head as you read it. You don't particularly want to be feeling your body resting on the seat. But all the rest of the time is a good time to do it. And I think you asked what leads to people succeeding or succeeding less with it.
What are the factors that will make it successful?
Yeah. I mean, above all else, it is just a very strong intention to do it, and that it's sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. I went without. Oh, we're freezing a bit. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you all right.
Okay, good. Yeah, I went for 8 years as an intermittent meditator without ever making it a daily practice, because I just didn't really have the strong intention. I didn't want to do it enough. Then at a certain point, I did want to do it enough, and I did it. So some people do have that strong intention, other people less so. However, ways to set yourself up for success. Well, I think the right instructions are very useful. People need to know what to do, and they also need to know that at first it's nigh on impossible. So the major stumbling block is the I can't do it one. You need to know that when you first start trying to be mindful, you won't be very mindful. You'll be mindful like 0.1% of the time, but you're going to try and get that up to like 3% of the time, and that will be a massive win that makes a difference. So people need to know that and have the right expectations there. I think context does matter, unfortunately. Some situations are harder and some are easier. If you're a parent with small children, it's going to be very, very, very hard, because people have just run off their feet. They're very, stressed in various ways. If you've got lots of time at your disposal, which I did at the point where I got really into it, it's much, much, much more possible. But another major factor that I encourage people to leverage is the social dimension. If you have friends that meditate, that is going to really help. If you have a place to go and meditate that you like going, that is going to really help. There's some meditation group you go to every week and you actually like it. That makes a tremendous difference, because we are social animals. We do take our cues from others. If everyone else in our life is just running around looking at their phones, not interested in mindfulness, we're going to find it hard to sustain our own interest. If we interact with other people who are doing the same thing and we hear from them about it and we talk to them about it, that's a huge advantage. So, I would always advise people, I would ask them, do you have a friend who meditates? If you don't, do you have one who would like to meditate and do this with you? Would your partner like to do it with you? So yes, I think that's a very big one.
It's that level of accountability, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and that, yeah. For sure. I mean, if you look at a Buddhist monastery, what is it except that? It's basically a bunch of people getting together and saying we're all going to basically do nothing else, and that's going to be easier if we're all in one place, seeing each other doing it.
And I think, we're talking about neurodivergent needs and varying needs, and a lot of people with autism or ADHD do well when they're body doubling with someone, and it's that's another way that people can do mindfulness. What way can mindfulness help manage those emotions and reactions in high stress situations, such as work or family conflicts? I think a lot of the time, I know when I get angry, it's very much in the moment. I'm angry right now, and a lot of people are like that, and that's what they're focused on right now, and they're unable to regulate themselves enough to cope with it.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
How can people implement that mindfully?
Yeah, it does take a lot of practice. I don't have it perfected. I don't always keep my temper with my kids by any means. I think I do find that I move on from the anger quickly, and maybe a lot quicker than I would once have done. So yeah, as you said, practice is key. You do have to, just like the person kicking the penalty in the World Cup, just like the person performing in a very high level concert, you need to practice really, really hard to be good at it and able to do it under pressure. I mean, I'm making it sound a bit off-putting. You have to practice hard. It is helpful to be committed to it. In the exact moment, what do you do? I think the procedure that I would suggest to people is, first of all, you need to notice that you're getting upset. And again, that comes with practice. It can become a kind of mindfulness alarm when you get upset. So I think nowadays it probably does happen for me that when I get angry, one of the things that happens is mindfulness switches on. I remember, oh yeah, I've got to be mindful now because I've just sort of, how have I had that happen? I think that partly happens naturally. So you need to just become aware of what's happening. Now you have to deal with your how you're feeling and what you're going to do about it. If you know how to do it, tune into the feeling in your body. But you do need to have that technique kind of down. If you don't, you might just get completely overwhelmed by the emotion. So I wouldn't say to do that when you're new to it, but at a certain point you can do that, tune into it in your body. If you don't feel able to do that, tune into a neutral sensation. So feel the feet on the floor. The feet aren't angry. The feet aren't thinking about, how annoying someone else has been. So if you put that if that's taking up some of your attention, it leaves less space for all the thoughts and the feelings of anger or upset. So tune into that, or tune into the body. And then you have to do the really hard and important bit, which is to behave how you want to. And this is actually where mindfulness alone isn't enough. And this has been a critique at various points in various contexts of this kind of mindfulness is, well, it's all well and good being in the present moment, but what about taking action and being a good person, or being the kind of person you want to be? In the religious context, those things were very much there. Mindfulness was one part of what you were meant to be doing, and the other parts included behave ethically and so on and so forth. So what happens to that? Well, it does still need to be there, as well as me being able to feel my feet or feel an emotion in my body. I also need to have some idea of how I want to be behaving, and I probably need to put some work in making sure that's front of mind as well. So a specific technique I often recommend, and I do it myself sometimes, is if you have managed to set up a daily meditation practice, at the start of each meditation, remind yourself of some way you want to be today. So if I want to not lose my temper with my kids, when I meditate, before I start, I need to focus in on that and really think, yeah, okay, that's what I want to do today. And then when they annoy me, which they inevitably will, mindfulness will kick in. I will tune into the emotion in my body. And I will also remember, Michael, you're meant to be gentle or something. And I may or may not then actually succeed in implementing that, but it's always a work in progress.
Absolutely. Um, Often people are, obsessed with progress, which is, I think it's a very human thing
Yeah.
to be like. How do you suggest individuals track their mindfulness progress?
Mm.
And what indicators should they look to assess
Mm.
the impact of the practice in daily life?
Yeah. I love this question because it actually gets at something awkward in mindfulness and meditation. Maybe going to get more than you wanted here in terms of where this takes us. It's tricky because part of mindfulness, as it's used in healthcare settings, that version of mindfulness, it involves precisely letting go of ideas about progress. Part of what we're learning is that our obsession with progress and trying to do things right and am I doing well, am I doing badly, that's what's making us miserable. And with mindfulness and meditation, we learn to step out of that, stop judging ourselves and our progress all the time, and just be. Which is great, but then there is this question of, yeah, but like, how do you know if that's working? How do you know if you're making progress? So we do have to kind of bring that back in and say, you are doing this because you hope it will make a change in your life, so how would you know? And how would you know? I think, well, it's a bit hard to know, honestly, I suppose. There are going to be people who are meditating and thinking, is it helping? I'm not sure. Maybe it is. And I've been like that sometimes in my practice. Is this progressing? I don't know. Am I in the same place as I was? Am I slowly progressing, or am I just in the same place? I don't know. But what you really want to see are obvious signs of progress. When it started to work for me, I had absolutely no doubt. It was just completely unignorable. Wow, okay, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening. I don't need anyone to confirm this for me. I just feel different. So that's great if that's happening. And it will be things like being calmer, being less lost in thought, more in the present moment, more emotionally open, less gripped by sort of addictive behaviors, able to leave alone the things that you normally can't. And then another big one is, yes, other people saying it. And of course, you can ask. You can ask your friend, your flatmate, your partner, your parents. You can ask anyone who knows you well, are you seeing any difference in me?
Is constant reflection important?
I think the answer is similar to about progress. It's like yes and no. Mindfulness is about stepping out of thought, which means kind of not reflecting. But we want to step out of thought in order to be able to re-engage with it in a more positive way. So we want to step out of rumination, where we're just endlessly churning on memories or problems, not getting anywhere. We want to step out of compulsive worrying. We want to step out of compulsive self-criticism. And then once we're able to do that, now we can re-engage in productive thought that takes us somewhere useful. And we can call that reflection. I think reflection is the right word for that. You want to be able to reflect because you're mindful instead of ruminating, worrying, unhelpfully, or criticizing yourself. And I suppose you do need some of that always. You need some basic level of self-monitoring and how am I doing? Am I behaving? Is my mindfulness leading me to behave well, or is it actually somehow making me behave worse? Am I doing better with my daily tasks, or am I actually not getting anything done because I'm sitting around being mindful all the time? You do want to be, I think you want to be monitoring it, but where I would probably land in the end is saying most of us who are bothering to learn something like mindfulness, we're more likely to have a problem with excessive self-examination than insufficient self-examination. Most of us, if there's some sort of a spectrum between the person who's constantly thinking about themselves and trying to, analyze themselves, and the person who never thinks about themselves, the average person who's new to mindfulness is probably on this side. So they could probably do with a little less self-inspection and a bit more just resting in the here and now and appreciating the beauty of the present moment and what have you.
In what way does the idea that mindfulness is all about clearing the mind
Mm,
represent practice, and how can individuals understand its true progress,
mm.
its true purpose?
Yeah. Again, it's a good question that gets at similar stuff. So, in the traditions that this stuff comes from, they are actually looking at mind clearing as what needs to happen. In Zen, which is probably the biggest influence on secular mindfulness, they do want you to meditate incredibly hard to the point where your mind will be completely empty of thoughts. And this takes, like weeks to months of meditating for hours and hours every day. So it ain't going to happen for most of us in daily life. Most of the people doing a mindfulness course and mindfulness that, it's definitely not going to happen. You're not going to clear the mind. It might calm down a bit, and that's nice. But there's a huge pitfall there, which is that if you want that to happen, it's just going to become a big source of suffering and actually get in your way. Because the average person living a normal life, when they sit down to meditate, the mind is going to be busy, the mind's going to be all over the place, they're going to be distracted. So you have to accept that. If you're preoccupied with quieting the mind, you're going to get very frustrated and you're not going to want to do the practice. So the way to approach it that's actually helpful for most people taking up meditation in an ordinary life is that thoughts will always be coming, and they'll be coming fast, and that's fine. The aim isn't to stop them. The aim is to notice more quickly when you've got caught up in them and snap out of it. So instead of being lost in thought for 5 minutes at a time before I snap out of it, I want to be lost in thought for 20 seconds before I snap out of it. Same amount of thoughts, except that the train of thought is interrupted more often by a moment of mindfulness. So that's the better way to think of it, I think, for most people. And if you keep doing that, the mind may well quieten down a bit, and that's lovely. And if you want to go further into meditation, you can develop that side of it. But you don't really need to get hung up on that and it's not helpful to get hung up on that to start to practice.
Okay. So we're going to go on to the segment that we spoke about before, that people wrote in. So I put a post out like 2 days ago, and we got 46 responses, and we managed to narrow it down to 8 people. And it's all around mindfulness and meditation and dealing with life situations. And you can give them advice. If you don't want to answer it, that's absolutely fine. We can move on to the next one. But yeah, so we'll start with the first one. Like, dear Michael, I love my children, but parenting is exhausting. I feel like I'm constantly juggling a million things, and my patience runs thin. How can I use mindfulness to stay calm and present instead of snapping at my children? I feel like you can relate to that one with Allah.
I can really relate to it, and I question whether I'm the right person to answer it, because I've never really got on top of this in the way that I would like to, because it is just so hard as a parent. But I do think it can make a difference. I do think it's made a difference to me in terms of snapping out of the anger, if not stopping me getting angry in the first place. What do you need to do? You just need, the most important thing is you need basic mindfulness. You need to be a bit more in the present moment, a bit less caught up in your own thoughts. And you're going to need to cultivate that in some of the ways I mentioned. Start tuning in to the feet touching the floor as often as you can throughout the day. And or start trying to be aware of what you're doing as you're doing it when you go through those boring childcare tasks. So I was earlier folding an enormous stack of my 4-year-old's t-shirts, and it was pretty boring. I'm not sure I was being that mindful, but I could have been. I could have been looking, feeling, trying to do it as well as I could. Some people are already plenty perfectionist enough. I'm not, so I should try and do it well. A lot of people should try and ease off on that, maybe. but bring full awareness of what you're doing. And then I think the other bit is that bit about working out how you want to behave. Get clear on what quality it is you want to bring to this: gentleness, kindness, calm, whatever. And hold that in mind, but also, and this is maybe the hard part, with a gigantic helping of self-compassion. That is critical. It's hard for many people, but I think step one for most people, well, anyone who's writing in with this question is obviously concerned to do their best as a parent. So they probably need to be kind to themselves about it more than they need to, be strict with themselves about it. So be clear how you want to parent, yes. Be aware in the present moment, yes. Try and parent that way, yes. But when you wander off your path, be kind to yourself. Just like when you're meditating on the breath, say, and your mind wanders off the breath, you have to be kind to yourself. It's all right. Just come back to it and keep going. When you're trying to be a kind or gentle parent and you realize you wandered off that path, okay, you've noticed, it's fine. There's no point beating yourself up about it. You don't need to, you don't deserve that. But just begin again in the same spirit as you wanted to be doing it.
That level of self-compassion, isn't it, that we were just talking about?
Yeah.
And I think that's really, really hard to practice when you want something so badly and you're so focused and driven to try and achieve that. The next one is, I've recently went through a painful breakup and I cannot stop obsessing over what went wrong. My mind keeps replaying conversations and I feel stuck in sadness and feel like I'm in a constant loop. Can mindfulness and meditation help me let go and move on?
Yes, I believe so. I mean, again, we've got to be realistic. Heartbreak is just an overwhelming experience. Mindfulness isn't a magic bullet that resolves all problems. It's not going to, at a stroke, take this away. It can, however, certainly reduce rumination, for sure. It can also help with processing emotions, mostly by overcoming our tendency to avoid emotions. So it can help us to engage with our emotions in a positive way and process them whilst not being quite so caught up in the stories, the thoughts. However, and I don't want to sound a note of pessimism, it is hard to do when you're in the middle of a crisis. So I'd say go for it, throw yourself at it. I was feeling upset about something in my love life when I got really into meditation. So go for it. It's a great time, but also recognize that the mind is a pretty wild and uncontrollable thing. And when it's upset about something, it's going to do what it's going to do. So don't be hard on yourself or too dismayed if you don't find that mindfulness, switches that off.
This next question is about chronic pain. I'm really curious about that. I don't have chronic pain, but I've never heard about mindfulness and physical health being associated. I've always heard it as you do that and this is the effect it's going to have on your physical health, but never to do with, So I'm interested to hear the answer about this too. I've been living with chronic pain for years and it affects every part of my life. People keep suggesting medication. I struggle to see how it helps, because it helps when the pain is so real. Can mindfulness really make a difference? If so, what can I do?
Yeah, I believe it can. I mean, of course, first, let's acknowledge just how unbelievably hard and awful it is to live with chronic pain. I mean, I don't experience that myself. I don't know what it's like. So I want to sort of caveat anything I'm going to say in that way. But yes, mindfulness became famous as a healthcare intervention because it was originally used for people who had the most intractable conditions, people who had terminal diagnoses of cancer, people who had awful chronic pain, people who the doctors were saying, we can't do anything for this person. And the guy who created secular mindfulness, or who did most for it, he said, give them to me. And he taught them mindfulness. So it's highly relevant. How can it help? It wouldn't aim to actually reduce the pain, but it would aim to reduce the experience of finding the pain so unpleasant. So it changes your relationship to the pain, which might sound weird. So we now know, I think, that pain is not just a matter of nerves firing and the signal goes up to the spinal cord and the brain. There's also signaling coming down from the brain to meet the signal that's coming up, because what's happening is that our experience of pain is a nerve signal plus some kind of a mental appraisal. The mind is reaching a verdict on that sensation. It's saying something about it. It's saying, we don't like this, it's awful. That's kind of happening below the level of awareness. You won't necessarily notice it. It just feels like it hurts. But actually part of that is it's a mental reaction. And mindfulness can start to help with that. You can learn to reduce the intensity of that mental reaction, which can mean that pain isn't experienced as quite so awful. And you can find this they did a study with Tibetan Buddhist monks, where they could see that when they gave them, I don't know, like an electric shock or something, you could see in the brain scanning, however they were doing it, you could see that the actual sensation was right there, actually stronger than in normal people. But there was another signature of the emotional reaction to the pain that was massively reduced in these monks. And indeed, it links back to, if we're interested in this, I'm not saying everyone has to care about this, there's a famous ancient text where the Buddha is talking about this, and he says very specifically, the ordinary person, when they experience a physical pain, they also experience a mental pain. My followers, if they've been doing it right, they experience the physical pain, but not the mental pain. And he seems to be pointing to this exact thing. So that's all a bit theoretical. In practice, yeah, it can work. And I know this in my own experience because I've done it. I've sat in meditation retreats where the pain can become quite strong from sitting in cross-legged meditation postures for many, many hours. I'm not saying it's anything like a person's chronic pain, but it really hurts. And you can actually focus in on the pain and meditate upon it and explore it in the most vivid detail that you can. And it turns out that that actually makes it way less bothersome and problematic. So it's this paradoxical move that we make in mindfulness where with a physical pain, you actually go in and get close to it and explore it with your attention. With an emotional pain, you focus in on the emotional sensations in the body and do the same. This actually seems to almost take you below the level of the mental reaction. It's like you drop below that down to just the raw sensation, and that's not as bad. That might sound weird, it might sound great, it does take a lot of practice, and of course it's not going to be a magic bullet, but long story short, yes, mindfulness has something to offer there.
Dear Michael, my job requires me to speak in meetings, but I get incredibly nervous. My heart races, my hands shake, my mind goes blank. Is there a mindfulness technique that can help me stay calm and confident in these moments?
Yeah. Yes. Again, I don't want to, create any expectation of magic bullets. For sure, the paradoxical thing with anxiety in general is that the more we try and avoid it and get away from it and want it to go away, the more it keeps coming back and stays strong or even gets stronger. Whereas if we can learn to, again, turn towards it, that actually turns out to work best. So if we're treating someone for a phobia, let's say it's spiders, the cure is to hold a spider, ultimately, in very brief terms. It's to experience the fear and let it happen and then discover that the world doesn't end. It gets a bit more complicated with things like public speaking. It's a bit more complicated than holding a spider, but that's kind of where we want to be going. So the basic attitude to it, we want to aim for something like, I might get extremely anxious, and that's okay. I'm still going to do it. I'll do it as best I can. And I accept that anxiety is a part of this, and I'm going to be all right with that as best I can. In terms of specific mindfulness techniques, again, it's the same two that I arrive at. One is focus on a neutral sensation and see how that can pull you a little bit out of the anxious thoughts that are troubling you so much. Not to make them go away, but just to be a bit less fully caught in them. The other, when you've practiced a good bit, this is further down the line, is you will be able to actually turn towards them and focus on the anxious sensations. But I definitely wouldn't do that straight off because you'll just get more anxious and upset and it'll all seem worse.
I often feel lonely even when I'm around people. My mind tells
Hmm.
me I do not belong or nobody really cares. I want to break free from these thoughts. What can I do to feel more connected and to calm my nervous system down?
Yeah, yeah. It's another, yeah, it's an unfortunately common experience that we can have. Job one, which this person's already doing, is notice that those thoughts are happening. Be aware of them rather than just thinking them and automatically believing them. So just notice, just be aware. It can be useful to give that story a name. Give it, oh, these are the disconnection thoughts, and just label it when it comes up. So that's a good start. I think self compassion is going to be tremendously relevant, but that does take time and it does take practice. So you could start to look at those techniques and explore them a little bit. The website selfcompassion.org was created by one of the main academic researchers in this field who's also taught it a lot. It's got loads of good stuff on it. Start to work on that stuff. But in the shorter term, I would suggest possibly focusing on behavior. So notice those thoughts that say you don't belong, you're disconnected. Notice them, and in noticing them, don't be quite so caught by them. And then ask, well, how would I behave if I did belong or if I did feel more connected? And see if you can do it. I mean, it's I suppose it's what's called fake it till you make it, which really has something to it. If we can act a little bit more in line with the way we want to be, it can change how we feel, and also it changes how the interaction goes. You will become more connected to people if you are able to act in line with a sense of connection rather than acting in line with the thoughts that say, I can't, and I don't belong. All easier said than done, of course, and no magic bullets, but that's the kind of direction I'd move in.
Finally, I feel like I'm always distracted by my phone, by emails, by my own thoughts. I struggle to focus on one task at a time, and it makes me less productive. How can I train my mind to stay present and stop jumping from one thing to another?
Yeah. Well, practice loads of mindfulness, meditate. If you can, persuade yourself to do it. If you can sit down and meditate for a period of time every day, practicing focusing, that should make a difference. Also, though, and this isn't really a mindfulness thing, changes in lifestyle are kind of what's needed here. I've known myself to become tremendously caught up in my phone in the past, and the thing that's tended to snap me out of it has actually been going on a meditation retreat where the phone is switched off for a week or 10 days or something, and you come out the other side of that with your phone addiction entirely gone. I'm not saying this person has to go and do a week long or 10-day retreat. They probably aren't in the market for that at the moment. But consider changes like that. Consider switching the phone off and leaving it in a drawer upstairs. At first, you will crave it, you'll keep thinking about it, but that will subside. If you make it a habit to leave the thing in another room at certain points in the day, your brain will get used to that and it will stop giving you those thoughts about your phone, and actually you'll start to feel more comfortable without it. I think probably those sorts of changes are needed to make a real difference in terms of this problem of distraction that is such a modern scourge.
So, what inspired you to pursue this topic and share it with our listeners?
I think ultimately it's my own experience. I just felt that meditation and mindfulness really changed my life and changed my inner experience, what it felt like to be me, more than probably anything else has. Certainly more than anything else that I could teach to other people. So I love it, and I'm always keen to share it with other people if I can.
Looking back on our conversation, what is the most important takeaway or message you want our audience to remember?
Oh dear, that's a very good question. I'm sorry to say it, but it might be the self-compassion piece, and I'm sorry to say it because it's a shame that should be, such a lack for us, and also because it's not always that easy for people. But that is a very, 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 very big thing. So I suppose the takeaway would be pursue mindfulness, but be aware that self-compassion is a really, really crucial companion to it.
Are there any upcoming projects, events, or resources you'd like to share with our audience?
Ah, the only thing would be that if you go to my website or my LinkedIn profile, you can download a free ebook, which I call my Mindfulness Starter Pack, and it does tell you, to the best of my ability, everything you need to know to get started and sort of keep going. I was quite pleased with it when I finished it. Yeah, it definitely represents what I think on that subject. You can download it. You'll need to give me your email address, which means that in the future, if I do have other things going on, I can let you know. But that's probably going to be quite rare. I might send the odd article out. So yes, that would be the thing to do. Go and download that and sign up to the mailing list.
Finally, where can our listeners find you or connect with you to stay up to date with your work?
Yeah. So that way, through giving me your email address, I'm on LinkedIn, although I don't necessarily say that much about my work. I just post about meditation and mindfulness. So if you want to just read about it and hear what I've got to say about it, that's a good place to do it. My guided meditations are on Spotify. If you Google my name, I think they'll come up. Also an app called Insight Timer, which I recommend very highly for anyone who's into meditation. It's a great app, and it's got loads of meditations on there, including mine. So yeah, feel free to like those, subscribe to them if it's possible to do that, and so on and so forth.
One last question. What is one thing that you're grateful for today?
Um, well, I'm grateful for this opportunity to be on this podcast, because that's it's a lovely opportunity to talk about something I'm really into, and quite apart from, it's lovely to get it out to other people, but it's nice to have the opportunity to think out loud about something I really care about.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming on. It was a pleasure to have you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks very much for having me. It's been great.
What an enlightening conversation we had today with Michael Eisen. Mindfulness and meditation have clearly showed us the immense power they hold, not just in managing stress or anxiety, but in cultivating a deeper connection with ourselves and navigating life's challenges with more presence and clarity. Whether you're new to these practices or you've been exploring them for a while, I hope this episode has inspired you to embrace mindfulness in your own life and to see how transformative it can be in therapy and beyond. Michael has shared some incredible insights and tools today, so don't be afraid to start small. Even a few minutes of mindfulness each day can make a world of difference. If you're curious to learn more, be sure to check out the resources Michael mentioned and dive deep into the world of mindfulness. And don't forget to share your thoughts or questions with us on social media. We love hearing from you and continuing these important conversations beyond the episode. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and a special thank you again to Michael for such a thought-provoking discussion. We've got even more inspiring episodes lined up, so make sure you stay connected and subscribe if you haven't already. Stay iconic. Until next time.